1. The theory of knowledge of Empirio-Criticism and of dialectical materialism. High sensations and complexes of sensations. The fundamental premises of the theory of knowledge of Mach and Avenarius are frankly, simply and clearly expounded by them in their early philosophical works. To these works we shall now turn, postponing for later treatment and examination of the corrections and emendations subsequently made by these writers. Mach wrote in 1872, "The task of science can only be, 1. To determine the laws of connection of ideas, psychology. 2. To discover the laws of connection of sensations, physics. 3. To explain the laws of connection between sensations and ideas, psychophysics." This is quite clear. The subject matter of physics is the connection between sensations, and not between things or bodies, of which our sensations are the image. And in 1883, in his Mechanics, Mach repeats the same thought: sensations are not symbols of things. The thing is rather a mental symbol for a complex of sensations of relative stability. Not the things, bodies, but colors, sounds, pressures, spaces, times, what we usually call sensations, are the real elements of the world. About this word elements, the fruit of 12 years of reflection, we shall speak later. At present let us note that Mach explicitly states here that things or bodies are complexes of sensations, and that he quite clearly sets up his own philosophical point of view against the opposite theory which holds that sensations are symbols of things. It would be more correct to say images or reflections of things. The latter theory is philosophical materialism. For instance, the materialist Friedrich Engels, the not unknown collaborator of Marx and a founder of Marxism, constantly and without exception speaks in his works of things and their mental pictures or images, Denkenbilder, and it is obvious that these mental images arise exclusively from sensations. It would seem that this fundamental standpoint of the philosophy of Marxism ought to be known to everyone who speaks of it, and especially to anyone who comes out in print in the name of this philosophy. But because of the extraordinary confusion which our Machians have introduced, it becomes necessary to repeat what is generally known. We turn to the first section of Anti-Düring and read Things and Their Mental Images. Or to the first section of the philosophical part, which reads, But whence does thought obtain these principles, that is, the fundamental principles of all knowledge? From itself? No. These forms can never be created and derived by thought out of itself, but only from the external world. The principles are not the starting point of the investigation, as Düring, who would be a materialist, but cannot consistently adhere to materialism, holds, but its final result. They are not applied to nature and human history, but abstracted from them. It is not nature and the realm of humanity which conform to these principles, but the principles are only valid in so far as they are in conformity with nature and history. That is the only materialistic conception of the matter, and Herr Düring's contrary conception is idealistic, makes things stand completely on their heads, and fashions the real world out of ideas. Ibid. p. 21. Engels, we repeat, applies this only materialistic conception everywhere and without exception, relentlessly attacking Düring for the least deviation from materialism to idealism. Anybody who reads Anti-Düring and Ludwig Feuerbach with the slightest care will find scores of instances when Engels speaks of things and their reflections in the human brain, in our consciousness, thought, etc. Engels does not say that sensations or ideas are symbols of things, for consistent materialism must here use image, picture, or reflection instead of symbol, as we shall show in detail in the proper place. But the question here is not of this or that formulation of materialism, but of the opposition of materialism to idealism, of the difference between the two fundamental lines in philosophy. Are we to proceed from things to sensation and thought? Or are we to proceed from thought and sensation to things? The first line, that is, the materialist line, is adopted by Engels. The second line, that is, the idealist line, is adopted by Mach. No evasions, no sophisms, a multitude of which we shall yet encounter, can remove the clear and indisputable fact that Ernst Mach's doctrine that things are complexes of sensations is subjective idealism and a simple rehash of Berkeleyanism. If bodies are complexes of sensations, as Mach says, or combinations of sensations, as Berkeley said, it inevitably follows that the whole world is but my idea. Starting from such a premise, it is impossible to arrive at the existence of other people besides oneself. It is the purest solipsism. Much as Mach, Avenarius, Petzold and the others may abjure solipsism, they cannot in fact escape solipsism without falling into howling logical absurdities. To make this fundamental element of the philosophy of Machism still clearer, we shall give a few additional quotations from Mach's works. Here is a sample from the Analyse der Empfindungen, Analysis of Sensations. We see a body with a point S. If we touch S, that is, bring it into contact with our body, we receive a prick. We can see S without feeling the prick. But as soon as we feel the prick, we find S on the skin. Thus, the visible point is a permanent nucleus, to which, according to circumstances, the prick is attached as something accidental. By frequent repetitions of analogous occurrences, we finally habituate ourselves to regard all properties of bodies as effects which proceed from permanent nuclei and are conveyed to the self through the medium of the body, which effects we call sensations. p. 20. In other words, people habituate themselves to adopt the standpoint of materialism, to regard sensations as the result of the action of bodies, things, nature on our sense organs. This habit, so noxious to the philosophical idealists, a habit acquired by all mankind and all natural science, is not at all to the liking of Mach, and he proceeds to destroy it. Thereby, however, these nuclei are deprived of their entire sensible content and are converted into naked abstract symbols. An old song, most worthy professor. This is a literal repetition of Berkeley, who said that matter is a naked abstract symbol. But it is Ernst Mach, in fact, who goes naked, for if he does not admit that the sensible content is an objective reality, existing independently of us, there remains only a naked abstract, I, an I infallibly written with a capital letter and italicized, equal to the insane piano, which imagined that it was the sole existing thing in this world. If the sensible content of our sensations is not the external world, then nothing exists save this naked I engaged in empty philosophical acrobatics. A stupid and fruitless occupation. It is then correct that the world consists only of our sensations, in which case we have knowledge only of sensations, and the assumption of those nuclei, and of their interaction, from which alone sensations proceed, turns out to be quite idle and superfluous. Such a view can only appeal to half-hearted realism or half-hearted criticism. We have quoted the 6th paragraph of Mach's Anti-Metaphysical Observations in full. It is a sheer plagiarism on Berkeley. Not a single idea, not a glimmer of thought, except that we sense only our sensations, from which there is only one possible inference, namely, that the world consists only of my sensations. The word "are" employed by Mach instead of "my" is employed illegitimately. By this word alone Mach betrays that half-heartedness of which he accuses others. For if the assumption of the existence of the external world is idle, if the assumption that the needle exists independently of me and that an interaction takes place between my body and the point of the needle is really idle and superfluous, then primarily the assumption of the existence of other people is idle and superfluous. Only I exist, and all other people, as well as the external world, come under the category of idle nuclei. Holding this point of view, one cannot speak of our sensations, and when Mach does speak of them, it is only a betrayal of his own amazing half-heartedness. It only proves that his philosophy is a jumble of idle and empty words in which their author himself does not believe. Here is a particularly graphic example of Mach's half-heartedness and confusion. In paragraph 6 of chapter 11 of the Analysis of Sensations we read, "If I imagine that while I am experiencing sensations, I or someone else could observe my brain with all possible physical and chemical appliances, it would be possible to ascertain with what processes of the organism particular sensations are connected." p. 197. Very well. This means, then, that our sensations are connected with definite processes, which take place in the organism in general, and in our brain in particular? Yes, Mach very definitely makes this assumption. It would be quite a task not to make it from the standpoint of natural science. But is not this the very assumption of those very same nuclei in their interaction, which our philosopher declared to be idle and superfluous? We are told that bodies are complexes of sensations. To go beyond that, Mach assures us, to regard sensations as a product of the action of bodies upon our sense organs, is metaphysics, an idle and superfluous assumption, etc., a la Berkeley. But the brain is a body. Consequently, the brain also is no more than a complex of sensations. It follows, then, that with the help of a complex of sensations I also am nothing but a complex of sensations, sense complexes of sensations. A delightful philosophy. First, sensations are declared to be the real elements of the world. On this an original Berkeleyanism is erected, and then the very opposite view is smuggled in, viz. that sensations are connected with definite processes in the organism. Are not these processes connected with an exchange of matter between the organism and the external world? Could this exchange of matter take place if the sensations of the particular organism did not give it an objectively correct idea of this external world? Mach does not ask himself such embarrassing questions when he mechanically jumbles fragments of Berkeleyanism with the views of natural science, which instinctively adheres to the materialist theory of knowledge. In the same paragraph Mach writes, "It is sometimes also asked whether inorganic matter experiences sensation. Does this mean that there is no doubt that organic matter experiences sensation? Does this mean that sensation is not something primary but that it is one of the properties of matter?" Mach skips over all the absurdities of Berkeleyanism. The question is natural enough if we proceed from the current widespread physical notions, according to which matter is the immediate and indisputably given reality, out of which everything, inorganic, is constructed. Let us bear in mind this truly valuable admission of Mach's that the current widespread physical notions regard matter as the immediate reality, and that only one variety of this reality, organic matter, possesses the well-defined property of sensation. Mach continues, then, indeed, sensation must suddenly arise somewhere in this structure consisting of matter, or else have previously been present in the foundation. From our standpoint the question is a false one. For us matter is not what is primarily given. Rather, what is primarily given are the elements which in a certain familiar relation are designated as sensations. What is primarily given, then, are sensations, although they are connected only with definite processes in organic matter. And while uttering such absurdities Mach wants to blame materialism, the current widespread physical notion, for leaving unanswered the question whence sensation arises. This is a sample of the refutation of materialism by the fideists and their hangers-on. Does any other philosophical standpoint solve a problem before enough data for its solution has been collected? Does not Mach himself say in the very same paragraph, so long as this problem, how far sensation extends in the organic world, has not been solved even in a single special case, no answer to the question is possible. The difference between materialism and Machism in this particular question thus consists in the following. Materialism, in full agreement with natural science, takes matter as primary and regards consciousness, thought, sensation as secondary, because in its well-defined form sensation is associated only with the higher forms of matter, organic matter, while in the foundation of the structure of matter, one can only surmise the existence of a faculty akin to sensation. Such, for example, is the supposition of the well-known German scientist Ernst Haeckel, the English biologist Lloyd Morgan and others, not to speak of Diderot's conjecture mentioned above. Machism holds to the opposite, the idealist point of view, and at once lands into an absurdity, since, in the first place, sensation is taken as primary, in spite of the fact that it is associated only with definite processes in matter organized in a definite way, and since, in the second place, The basic premise that bodies are complexes of sensations is violated by the assumption of the existence of other living beings and, in general, of other complexes besides the given great I. The word element, which many naive people, as we shall see, take to be some sort of a new discovery, in reality only obscures the question, for it is a meaningless term which creates the false impression that a solution or a step forward has been achieved. This impression is a false one, because there still remains to be investigated and reinvestigated how matter, apparently entirely devoid of sensation, is related to matter which, though composed of the same atoms, or electrons, is yet endowed with a well-defined faculty of sensation. Materialism clearly formulates the as yet unsolved problem and thereby stimulates the attempt to solve it, to undertake further experimental investigation. Machism, which is a species of muddled idealism, befogs the issue and sidetracks it by means of the futile verbal trick, element. Here is a passage from Mach's latest, comprehensive and conclusive philosophical work that clearly betrays the falsity of this idealist trick. In his Knowledge and Error we read, while there is no difficulty in constructing aufzubauen every physical experience out of sensations, that is, psychical elements, it is impossible to imagine, ist keine Möglichkeit abzusehen, how any psychical experience can be composed, darstellen, of the elements employed in modern physics, that is, mass and motion, in their rigidity, stirrheit, which is serviceable only for this special science. 6. Of the rigidity of the conceptions of many modern scientists, and of their metaphysical, in the Marxist sense of the term, that is, anti-dialectical, views, Engels speaks repeatedly and very precisely. We shall see later that it was just on this point that Mach went astray, because he did not understand or did not know the relation between relativism and dialectics. But this is not what concerns us here. It is important for us here to note how glaringly Mach's idealism emerges, in spite of the confused, ostensibly new, terminology. There is no difficulty, you see, in constructing any physical element out of sensations, that is, psychical elements. Oh yes, such constructions, of course, are not difficult, for they are purely verbal constructions, shallow scholasticism, serving as a loophole for fideism. It is not surprising after this that Mach dedicates his works to the eminentists. It is not surprising that the eminentists, who profess the most reactionary kind of philosophical idealism, welcome Mach with open arms. The recent positivism of Ernst Mach was only about 200 years too late. Berkeley had already sufficiently shown that out of sensations, that is, psychical elements, nothing can be built except solipsism. As regards materialism, against which Mach here, too, sets up his own views, without frankly and explicitly naming the enemy, we have already seen in the case of Diderot what the real views of the materialists are. These views do not consist in deriving sensation from the movement of matter or in reducing sensation to the movement of matter, but in recognizing sensation as one of the properties of matter in motion. On this question Engels shared the standpoint of Diderot. Engels dissociated himself from the vulgar materialists, Vogt, Buchner and Maleschaft, for the very reason, among others, that they erred in believing that the brain secretes thought in the same way as the liver secretes bile. But Mach, who constantly sets up his views in opposition to materialism, ignores, of course, all the great materialists, Diderot, Feuerbach, Marx and Engels, just as all other official professors of official philosophy do. In order to characterize Avenarius' earliest and basic view, let us take his first independent philosophical work, Philosophy as a Conception of the World According to the Principle of the Minimum Expenditure of Effort. Prolegomena to a Critique of Pure Experience, which appeared in 1876. Bogdanov in his Empirio-Monism, Book 1, 2nd ed. 1905, p. 9, note, says that in the development of Mach's views, the starting point was philosophical idealism, while a realistic tinge was characteristic of Avenarius from the very beginning. Bogdanov said so because he believed what Mach said. Bogdanov should not have believed Mach, and his assertion is diametrically opposed to the truth. On the contrary, Avenarius' idealism emerges so clearly in his work of 1876 that Avenarius himself in 1891 was obliged to admit it. In the introduction to the human concept of the world, Avenarius says, He who has read my first systematic work, philosophy, etc., will at once have presumed that I would have attempted to treat the problems of a criticism of pure experience from the idealist standpoint. But the sterility of philosophical idealism compelled me to doubt the correctness of my previous path. P. X. This idealist starting point of Avenarius is universally acknowledged in philosophical literature. Of the French writers I shall refer to Ch1, who says that Avenarius' philosophical standpoint in the Prolegomena is monistic idealism. Of the German writers, I shall name Rudolf Willi, Avenarius' disciple, who says that Avenarius in his youth, and particularly in his work of 1876, was totally under the spell, ganz im Bann, of so-called epistemological idealism. And, indeed, it would be ridiculous to deny the idealism in Avenarius' Prolegomena, where he explicitly states that only sensation can be thought of as the existing. Pages 10 and 65 of the second German edition. All italics and quotations are ours. This is how Avenarius himself presents the contents of paragraph 116 of his work. Here is the paragraph in full. We have recognized that the existing, das Sehend, is substance endowed with sensation. The substance falls away. It is more economical. Don't you see? There is a lesser expenditure of effort in thinking that there is no substance and that no external world exists. Sensation remains. We must then regard the existing as sensation, at the basis of which there is nothing which does not possess sensation, nichts empfindungsloses. Sensation, then, exists without substance, that is, thought exists without brain. Are there really philosophers capable of defending this brainless philosophy? There are. Professor Richard Avenarius is one of them. And we must pause for a while to consider this defense, difficult though it be for a normal person to take it seriously. Here, in paragraph 89 and 90 of this same work, is Avenarius' argument. The proposition that motion produces sensation is based on apparent experience only. This experience, which includes the act of perception, consists, presumably, in the fact that sensation is generated in a certain kind of substance, brain, as a result of transmitted motion, excitation, and with the help of other material conditions, for example, blood. However, apart from the fact that such generation has never itself been observed, in order to construct the supposed experience, as an experience which is real in all its component parts, empirical proof, at least, is required to show that sensation, which assumedly is caused in a certain substance by transmitted motion, did not already exist in that substance in one way or another, so that the appearance of sensation cannot be conceived of in any other way than as a creative act on the part of the transmitted motion. Thus only by proving that where a sensation now appears there was none previously, not even a minimal one, would it be possible to establish a fact which, denoting as it does some act of creation, contradicts all the rest of experience, and radically changes all the rest of our conception of nature, Naturensgang. But such proof is not furnished by any experience, and cannot be furnished by any experience. On the contrary, the notion of a state of a substance totally devoid of sensation, which subsequently begins to experience sensation, is only a hypothesis. But this hypothesis merely complicates and obscures our understanding instead of simplifying and clarifying it. Should the so-called experience, viz., that the sensation is caused by transmitted motion in a substance that begins to perceive from this moment, prove upon closer examination to be only apparent, there still remains sufficient material in the content of the experience to ascertain at least the relative origin of sensation from conditions of motion, namely, to ascertain that the sensation which is present, although latent or minimal, or for some other reason not manifest to the consciousness, becomes, owing to transmitted motion, released or enhanced or made manifest to the consciousness. However, even this bit of the remaining content of experience is only an appearance. Were we even by an ideal observation to trace the motion proceeding from the moving substance A, transmitted through a series of intermediate centers, and reaching the substance B, which is endowed with sensation, we should at best find that sensation in substance B is developed or becomes enhanced simultaneously with the reception of the incoming motion, but we should not find that this occurred as a consequence of the motion. We have purposely quoted this refutation of materialism by Avenarius in full, in order that the reader may see to what truly pitiful sophistries recent empirio-critical philosophy resorts. We shall compare with the argument of the idealist Avenarius the materialist argument of Bogdanov, if only to punish Bogdanov for his betrayal of materialism. In long bygone days, fully 9 years ago, when Bogdanov was half a natural historical materialist, that is, an adherent of the materialist theory of knowledge, to which the overwhelming majority of contemporary scientists instinctively hold, when he was only half led astray by the muddled Ostwald, he wrote, "From ancient times to the present day, descriptive psychology has adhered to the classification of the facts of consciousness into 3 categories: the domain of sensations and ideas, the domain of emotions, and the domain of impulses. To the first category belong the images of phenomena of the outer or inner world, as taken by themselves in consciousness. Such an image is called a sensation if it is directly produced through the sense organs by its corresponding external phenomenon." And a little further on he says, "Sensation arises in consciousness as a result of a certain impulse from the external environment transmitted by the external sense organs." p. 222. And further, sensation is the foundation of mental life. It is its immediate connection with the external world. p. 240. At each step in the process of sensation, a transformation of the energy of external excitation into a state of consciousness takes place. p. 133. And even in 1905, when with the gracious assistance of Ostwald and Mach, Bogdanov had already abandoned the materialist standpoint in philosophy for the idealist standpoint, he wrote, "From forgetfulness." In his Empirio-Monism, as is known, the energy of external excitation, transformed at the nervines into a telegraphic form of nerve current, still insufficiently investigated but devoid of all mysticism, first reaches the neurons that are located in the so-called lower centers, ganglial, cerebrospinal, subcortical, etc. Book 1, 2nd ed. 1905, p. 118. For every scientist who has not been led astray by professorial philosophy, as well as for every materialist, sensation is indeed the direct connection between consciousness and the external world. It is the transformation of the energy of external excitation into a state of consciousness. This transformation has been, and is, observed by each of us a million times on every hand. The sophism of idealist philosophy consists in the fact that it regards sensation as being not the connection between consciousness and the external world, but a fence, a wall, separating consciousness from the external world, not an image of the external phenomenon corresponding to the sensation, but as the sole entity. Avenarius gave but a slightly changed form to this old sophism, which had been already worn threadbare by Bishop Berkeley. Since we do not yet know all the conditions of the connection we are constantly observing between sensation and matter organized in a definite way, let us therefore acknowledge the existence of sensation alone. That is what the sophism of Avenarius reduces itself to. To conclude our description of the fundamental idealist premises of Empirio-Criticism, we shall briefly refer to the English and French representatives of this philosophical trend. Mach explicitly says of Karl Pearson, the Englishman, that he, Mach, is in agreement with his epistemological, erkenntniskritischen, views on all essential points. Mechanic, ed. Previously cited, p. 9. Pearson in turn agrees with Mach. For Pearson, real things are sense impressions. He declares the recognition of things outside the boundaries of sense impressions to be metaphysics. Pearson fights materialism with great determination, although he does not know Feuerbach, or Marx and Engels. His arguments do not differ from those analyzed above. However, the desire to masquerade as a materialist is so foreign to Pearson that is a specialty of the Russian Machians. Pearson is so incautious that he invents no new names for his philosophy and simply declares that his views and those of Mach are idealist. Ibid. p. 326. He traces his genealogy directly to Berkeley and Hume. The philosophy of Pearson, as we shall repeatedly find, is distinguished from that of Mach by its far greater integrity and consistency. Mach explicitly declares his solidarity with the French physicists, Pierre Duhem and Henri Poincaré. We shall have occasion to deal with the particularly confused and inconsistent philosophical views of these writers in the chapter on the new physics. Here we shall content ourselves with noting that for Poincaré things are groups of sensations, and that a similar view is casually expressed by Duhem. We shall now proceed to examine how Mach and Avenarius, having admitted the idealist character of their original views, corrected them in their subsequent works. The discovery of the world elements, such as the title under which Friedrich Adler, lecturer at the University of Zurich, probably the only German author also anxious to supplement Marx with Machism, writes of Mach. And this naive university lecturer must be given his due. In his simplicity of heart he does Machism more harm than good. At least, he puts the question point blank, did Mach really discover the world elements? If so, then only very backward and ignorant people, of course, can still remain materialists. Or is this discovery a return on the part of Mach to the old philosophical errors? We saw that Mach in 1872 and Avenarius in 1876 held a purely idealist view. For them the world is our sensation. In 1883 Mach's Mechanik appeared, and in the preface to the first edition Mach refers to Avenarius' Prolegomena, and greets his ideas as being very close, sehr verwandt, to his own philosophy. Here are the arguments in the Mechanik concerning the elements. All natural science can only picture and represent, Nachbilden und Vorbilden, complexes of those elements which we ordinarily call sensations. It is a matter of the connection of these elements. The connection of A, heat, with B, flame, is a problem of physics, that of A and N, nerves, a problem of physiology. Neither exists separately. Both exist in conjunction. Only temporarily can we neglect either. Even processes that are apparently purely mechanical are thus always physiological. Opposite. German ed. p. 498. We find the same in the analysis of sensations, wherever the term sensation, complex of sensations, are used alongside of or in place of the terms element, complex of elements. It must be borne in mind that it is only in this connection, namely, in the connection of A, B, C with K, L, M, that is, in the connection of complexes which we ordinarily call bodies with the complex which we call our body, and relation, only in this functional dependence that the elements are sensations. In another functional dependence they are at the same time physical objects. Russian translation, pages 23 and 17. A color is a physical object when we consider its dependence, for instance, upon the source of illumination, other colors, temperatures, spaces and so forth. When we, however, consider its dependence upon the retina, the elements K, L, M, it is a psychological object, a sensation. Ibid. p. 24. Thus the discovery of the world elements amounts to this: 1. All that exists is declared to be sensation. 2. Sensations are called elements. 3. Elements are divided into the physical and the psychical. The latter is that which depends on the human nerves and the human organism generally. The former does not depend on them. 4. The connection of physical elements and the connection of psychical elements, it is declared, do not exist separately from each other. They exist only in conjunction. 5. It is possible only temporarily to leave one or the other connection out of account. 6. The new theory is declared to be free from one-sidedness. Indeed, it is not one-sidedness we have here, but an incoherent jumble of antithetical philosophical points of view. Since you base yourself only on sensations, you do not correct the one-sidedness of your idealism by the term element, but only confuse the issue and cravenly hide from your own theory. In a word, you eliminate the antithesis between the physical and psychical, between materialism, which regards nature, matter, as primary, and idealism, which regards spirit, mind, sensation as primary. Indeed, you promptly restore this antithesis. you restore it surreptitiously, retreating from your own fundamental premise. For, if elements are sensations, you have no right even for a moment to accept the existence of elements independently of my nerves and my mind. But if you do admit physical objects that are independent of my nerves and my sensations and that cause sensation only by acting upon my retina, you are disgracefully abandoning your one-sided idealism and adopting the standpoint of one-sided materialism. If color is a sensation only depending upon the retina, as natural science compels you to admit, then light rays, falling upon the retina, produce the sensation of color. This means that outside us, independently of us and of our minds, there exists a movement of matter, let us say of ether waves of a definite length and of a definite velocity, which, acting upon the retina, produce in man the sensation of a particular color. This is precisely how natural science regards it. It explains the sensations of various colors by the various lengths of light waves existing outside the human retina, outside man and independently of him. This is materialism. Matter acting upon our sense organs produces sensation. Sensation depends on the brain, nerves, retina, etc., that is, on matter organized in a definite way. The existence of matter does not depend on sensation. Matter is primary. Sensation, thought, consciousness are the supreme product of matter organized in a particular way. Such are the views of materialism in general, and of Marx and Engels in particular. Mach and Avenarius secretly smuggle in materialism by means of the word element, which supposedly frees their theory of the one-sidedness of subjective idealism, supposedly permits the assumption that the mental is dependent on the retina, nerves and so forth, and the assumption that the physical is independent of the human organism. In fact, of course, the trick with the word element is a wretched sophistry, for a materialist who reads Mach and Avenarius will immediately ask, what are the elements? It would, indeed, be childish to think that one can dispose of the fundamental philosophical trends by inventing a new word. Either the element is a sensation, as all Empirio-Criticists, Mach, Avenarius, Petzold, etc., maintain, in which case your philosophy, gentlemen, is idealism vainly seeking to hide the nakedness of its solipsism under the cloak of a more objective terminology, or the element is not a sensation, in which case absolutely no thought whatever is attached to the new term. It is merely an empty bauble. Take Petzold, for instance, the last word in Empirio-Criticism, as V. Lesevich, the first and most outstanding Russian Empirio-Criticist, describes him. Having defined elements as sensations, he says in the second volume of the work mentioned, in the statement that sensations are the elements of the world, one must guard against taking the term sensation as denoting something only subjective and therefore ethereal, transforming the ordinary picture of the world into an illusion, verflechtigend des. One speaks of what hurts one most. Petzold feels that the world evaporates, verflechtigt sich, or becomes transformed into an illusion, when sensations are regarded as world elements. And the good Petzold imagines that he helps matters by the reservation that sensation must not be taken as something only subjective. Is this not a ridiculous sophistry? Does it make any difference whether we take sensation as sensation or whether we try to stretch the meaning of the term? Does this do away with the fact that sensations in man are connected with normally functioning nerves, retina, brain, etc., that the external world exists independently of our sensations? If you are not trying to evade the issue by a subterfuge, if you are really in earnest in wanting to guard against subjectivism and solipsism, you must above all guard against the fundamental idealist premises of your philosophy. You must replace the idealist line of your philosophy, from sensations to the external world, by the materialist line, from the external world to sensations. You must abandon that empty and muddled verbal embellishment, element, and simply say that color is the result of the action of a physical object on the retina, which is the same as saying that sensation is a result of the action of matter on our sense organs. Let us take Avenarius. The most valuable material on the question of the elements is to be found in his last work, and, it might be said, the most important for the comprehension of his philosophy, Notes on the Concept of the Subject of Psychology. The author, by the way, here gives a very graphic table the main part of which we reproduce here. Table 1.1a Elements, complexes of elements. I things, or the substantial, Sachhafts, corporeal things. 2. Thoughts, or the mental, Gedankenhafts, incorporeal things, recollections and fantasies. Compare this with what Mach says after all his elucidation of the elements. It is not bodies that produce sensations, but complexes of elements, complexes of sensations, that make up bodies. Here you have the discovery of the world elements that overcomes the one-sidedness of idealism and materialism. At first we are assured that the elements are something new, both physical and psychical at the same time. Then a little correction is surreptitiously inserted. Instead of the crude, materialist differentiation of matter, bodies, things, and the psychical, sensations, recollections, fantasies, we are presented with the doctrine of recent positivism regarding elements substantial and elements mental. Adler, Fritz, did not gain very much from the discovery of the world elements. Bogdanov, arguing against Plekhanov in 1906, wrote, "I cannot own myself a Machian in philosophy. In the general philosophical conception there is only one thing I borrowed from Mach, the idea of the neutrality of the elements of experience in relation to the physical and psychical, and the dependence of these characteristics solely on the connection of experience." Empirio-Criticism, Book 3, St. Petersburg, 1906, p. Xli. This is as though a religious man were to say, "I cannot own myself a believer in religion, for there is only one thing I have borrowed from the believers, the belief in God." This only one thing, which Bogdanov borrowed from Mach, is the basic error of Machism, the basic falsity of its entire philosophy. Those deviations of Bogdanov's from Empirio-Criticism to which he himself attaches great significance are in fact of entirely secondary importance and amount to nothing more than inconsiderable private and individual differences between the various Empirio-Criticists who are approved by Mach and who approve Mach. We shall speak of this in greater detail later. Hence when Bogdanov was annoyed at being confused with the Machians, he only revealed his failure to understand what radically distinguishes materialism from what is common to Bogdanov and to all other Machians. How Bogdanov developed, improved or worsened Machism is not important. What is important is that he has abandoned the materialist standpoint and has thereby inevitably condemned himself to confusion and idealist aberrations. In 1899, as we saw, Bogdanov had the correct standpoint when he wrote, "The image of the man before me, directly given to me by vision, is a sensation." Bogdanov did not trouble to give a criticism of this earlier position of his. He blindly believed Mach and began to repeat after him that the elements of experience are neutral in relation to the physical and psychical. As has been established by recent positivist philosophy, wrote Bogdanov in Book I of Empirio-Monism, the elements of psychical experience are identical with the elements of experience in general, as they are identical with the elements of physical experience. Or in 1906, BK 3, p. XX, as to idealism, can it be called idealism merely on the grounds that the elements of physical experience are regarded as identical with the elements of psychical experience, or with elementary sensations, when this is simply an indubitable fact? Here we have the true source of all Bogdanov's philosophical misadventures, a source which he shares with the rest of the Machians. We can and must call it idealism when the elements of physical experience, that is, the physical, the external world, matter, are regarded as identical with sensations, for this is sheer Berkeleyanism. There is not a trace here of recent philosophy, or positivist philosophy, or of indubitable fact. It is merely an old idealist sophism. And were one to ask Bogdanov how he would prove the indubitable fact that the physical is identical with sensations, one would get no other argument save the eternal refrain of the idealists, "I am aware only of my sensations." The testimony of self-consciousness, Die Aussage des Selbstbewusstseins, of Avenarius in his Prolegomena. Or, in our experience, which testifies that we are sentient substance, sensation is given us with more certainty than is substantiality, and so on and so forth. Bogdanov, trusting Mach, accepted a reactionary philosophical trick as an indubitable fact. For, indeed, not a single fact was or could be cited which would refute the view that sensation is an image of the external world, a view which was shared by Bogdanov in 1899 and which is shared by natural science to this day. In his philosophical wanderings, the physicist Mach has completely strayed from the path of modern science. Regarding this important circumstance, which Bogdanov overlooked, we shall have much to say later. One of the circumstances which helped Bogdanov to jump so quickly from the materialism of the natural scientist to the muddled idealism of Mach was, apart from the influence of Ostwald, Avenarius' doctrine of the dependent and independent series of experience. Bogdanov himself expounds the matter in Book I of his Empirio-Monism thus: insofar as the data of experience appear in dependence upon the state of the particular nervous system, they form the psychical world of the particular person. Insofar as the data of experience are taken outside of such a dependence, we have before us the physical world. Avenarius therefore characterizes these two realms of experience respectively as the dependent series and the independent series of experience. p. 18. That is just the whole trouble. The doctrine of the independent, that is, independent of human sensation, series is a surreptitious importation of materialism, which, from the standpoint of a philosophy that maintains that bodies are complexes of sensations, that sensations are identical with physical elements, is illegitimate, arbitrary, and eclectic. For once you have recognized that the source of light and light waves exists independently of man and the human consciousness, that color is dependent on the action of these waves upon the retina, you have in fact adopted the materialist standpoint and have completely destroyed all the indubitable facts of idealism, together with all the complexes of sensations, the elements discovered by recent positivism, and similar nonsense. That is just the whole trouble. Bogdanov, like the rest of the Russian Machians, has never looked into the idealist views originally held by Mach and Avenarius, has never understood their fundamental idealist premises, and has therefore failed to discover the illegitimacy and eclecticism of their subsequent attempts to smuggle in materialism surreptitiously. Yet, just as the initial idealism of Mach and Avenarius is generally acknowledged in philosophical literature, so is it generally acknowledged that subsequently Empirio-Criticism endeavored to swing towards materialism. Quillart, the French writer quoted above, asserts that Avenarius' prolegomena is monistic idealism, the critique of pure experience is absolute realism, while the human concept of the world is an attempt to explain the change. Let us note that the term realism is here employed as the antithesis of idealism. Following Engels, I use only the term materialism in this sense, and consider it the sole correct terminology, especially since the term realism has been bedraggled by the positivists and the other muddleheads who oscillate between materialism and idealism. For the present it will suffice to note that Quillart had the indisputable fact in mind that in the prolegomena sensation, according to Avenarius, is the only entity, while substance, in accordance with the principle of the economy of thought, is eliminated, and that in the critique of pure experience the physical is taken as the independent series, while the psychical and, consequently, sensations, are taken as the dependent series. Avenarius' disciple Rudolf Willi likewise admits that Avenarius was a complete idealist in 1876, but subsequently reconciled Husk-like naive realism, that is, the instinctive, unconscious materialist standpoint adopted by humanity, which regards the external world as existing independently of our minds, with this teaching. Locke. Cit. Oscar Ewald, the author of the book Avenarius as the founder of Empirio-Criticism, says that this philosophy combines contradictory idealist and realist, he should have said materialist, elements, not in Mach's sense, but in the human sense of the term element. For example, the absolute method of consideration would perpetuate naive realism, the relative would declare exclusive idealism as permanent. 25. Avenarius calls the absolute method of consideration that which corresponds to Mach's connection of elements outside our body, and the relative that which corresponds to Mach's connection of elements dependent on our body. But of particular interest to us in this respect is the opinion of Wundt, who himself, like the majority of the above-mentioned writers, adheres to the confused idealist standpoint, but who has analyzed Empirio-Criticism perhaps more attentively than all the others. p. Yushkevich has the following to say in this connection: "It is interesting to note that Wundt regards Empirio-Criticism as the most scientific form of the latest type of materialism, that is, the type of those materialists who regard the spiritual as a function of corporeal processes, and whom, we would add, Wundt defines as standing midway between Spinozism and absolute materialism." True, this opinion of Wundt's is extremely interesting. But what is even more interesting is Mr. Yushkevich's attitude towards the books and articles on philosophy of which he treats. This is a typical example of the attitude of our Machians to such matters. Gogol's Petrushka used to read and find it interesting that letters always combine to make words. Mr. Yushkevich read Wundt and found it interesting that Wundt accused Avenarius of materialism. If Wundt is wrong, why not refute him? If he is right, why not explain the antithesis between materialism and Empirio-Criticism? Mr. Yushkevich finds what the idealist Wundt says interesting, but this Machian regards it as a waste of effort to endeavor to go to the root of the matter, probably on the principle of the economy of thought. The point is that by informing the reader that Wundt accuses Avenarius of materialism, and by not informing him that Wundt regards some aspects of Empirio-Criticism as materialism and others as idealism, and holds that the connection between the two is artificial, Yushkevich entirely distorted the matter. Either this gentleman absolutely does not understand what he reads, or he was prompted by a desire to indulge in false self-praise with the help of Wundt, as if to say, "You see, the official professors regard us, too, as materialists, and not as muddleheads." The above-mentioned article by Wundt constitutes a large book, more than 300 pages, devoted to a detailed analysis first of the immanentist school, and then of the Empirio-Criticists. Why did Wundt connect these two schools? Because he considers them closely akin, and this opinion, which is shared by Mach, Avenarius, Petzold and the immanentists is, as we shall see later, entirely correct. Wundt shows in the first part of this article that the immanentists are idealists, subjectivists and adherents of fideism. This too, as we shall see later, is a perfectly correct opinion, although Wundt expounds it with a superfluous ballast of professorial erudition, with superfluous niceties and reservations, which is to be explained by the fact that Wundt himself is an idealist and fideist. He reproaches the immanentists not because they are idealists and adherents of fideism, but because, in his opinion, they arrive at these great principles by incorrect methods. Further, the second and third parts of Wundt's article are devoted to Empirio-Criticism. There he quite definitely points out that very important theoretical propositions of Empirio-Criticism, for example, the interpretation of experience and the principal coordination, of which we shall speak later, are identical with those held by the immanentists. Die Empirio-Kritische Übereinstimmung mit der immanenten Philosophie nimmt, p. 382 of Wundt's article. Other of Avenarius' theoretical propositions are borrowed from materialism, and in general Empirio-Criticism is a motley, in which the various component elements are entirely heterogeneous. Wundt regards Avenarius' doctrine of the independent vital series, in particular, as one of the materialist morsels of the Avenarius Mach hodgepodge. If you start from the system C, that is how Avenarius, who was very fond of making erudite play of new terms, designates the human brain or the nervous system in general, and if the mental is for you a function of the brain, then this system C is a metaphysical substance, says Wundt, and your doctrine is materialism. It should be said that many idealists and all agnostics, Kantians and Humeans included, call the materialists metaphysicians, because it seems to them that to recognize the existence of an external world independent of the human mind is to transcend the bounds of experience. Of this terminology and its utter incorrectness from the point of view of Marxism, we shall speak in its proper place. Here it is important to note that the recognition of the independent series by Avenarius, and also by Mach, who expresses the same idea in different words, is, according to the general opinion of philosophers of various parties, that is, of various trends in philosophy, an appropriation from materialism. If you assume that everything that exists is sensation, or that bodies are complexes of sensations, you cannot, without violating all your fundamental premises, all your philosophy, arrive at the conclusion that the physical exists independently of our minds, and that sensation is a function of matter organized in a definite way. Mach and Avenarius, in their philosophy, combine fundamental idealist premises with individual materialist deductions for the very reason that their theory is an example of that pauper's broth of eclecticism, of which Engels speaks with just contempt. This eclecticism is particularly marked in Mach's latest philosophical work, Knowledge and Error, 2nd edition, 1906. We have already seen that Mach there declared that there is no difficulty in constructing every physical element out of sensation, that is, out of psychical elements, and in the same book we read, dependencies outside the boundary U are physics in the broadest sense. p. 323, paragraph 4. To obtain those dependencies in a pure state, Rainer Helton, it is necessary as much as possible to eliminate the influence of the observer, that is, of those elements that lie within you. Locke. Set. Well, the Titmouse first promised to set the sea on fire. That is, to construct physical elements from psychical elements, and then it turns out that physical elements lie beyond the boundary of psychical elements, which lie within our body. A remarkable philosophy. Another example, a perfect Volkommens gas, a perfect liquid, a perfect elastic body, does not exist. The physicist knows that his fictions only approximate to the facts and arbitrarily simplify them. He is aware of the divergence, which cannot be eliminated. p. 418, paragraph 30. What divergence, Abweichung, is meant here? The divergence of what from what? Of thought, physical theory, from the facts. And what are thoughts, ideas? Ideas are the tracks of sensations. p. 9. And what are facts? Facts are complexes of sensations. And so, the divergence of the tracks of sensations from complexes of sensations cannot be eliminated. What does this mean? It means that Mach forgets his own theory and, when treating of various problems of physics, speaks plainly, without idealist twists, that is, materialistically. All the complexes of sensations and the entire stock of Berkeleyan wisdom vanish. The physicist's theory proves to be a reflection of bodies, liquids, gases existing outside us and independently of us, a reflection which is, of course, approximate. But to call this approximation or simplification arbitrary is wrong. In fact, sensation is here regarded by Mach just as it is regarded by all science which has not been purified by the disciples of Berkeley and Hume, viz. as an image of the external world. Mach's own theory is subjective idealism, but when the factor of objectivity is required, Mach unceremoniously inserts into his arguments the premises of the contrary, that is, the materialist theory of knowledge. Edward von Hartmann, a consistent idealist and consistent reactionary in philosophy, who sympathizes with the Machians' fight against materialism, comes very close to the truth when he says that Mach's philosophical position is a mixture, Nicht-Unterscheidung, of naive realism and absolute illusionism. That is true. The doctrine that bodies are complexes of sensations, etc., is absolute illusionism, that is, solipsism. For from this standpoint the world is nothing but my illusion. On the other hand, Mach's aforementioned argument, as well as many other of his fragmentary arguments, is what is known as naive realism, that is, the materialist theory of knowledge unconsciously and instinctively taken over from the scientists. Avenarius and the professors who follow in his footsteps attempt to disguise this mixture by the theory of the principal coordination. We shall proceed to examine this theory presently, but let us first finish with the charge that Avenarius is a materialist. Mr. Yushkevich, to whom one's opinion which he failed to understand seemed so interesting, was either himself not enough interested to learn, or else did not condescend to inform the reader how Avenarius' nearest disciples and successors reacted to this charge. Yet this is necessary to clarify the matter if we are interested in the relation of Marx's philosophy, that is, materialism, to the philosophy of Empirio-Criticism. Moreover, if Machism is a muddle, a mixture of materialism and idealism, it is important to know whether this current turned, if we may so express it, after the official idealists began to disown it because of its concessions to materialism. Want was answered, among others, by two of Avenarius' purest and most orthodox disciples, J. Petzold and F. Karstanjan. Petzold, with haughty resentment, repudiated the charge of materialism, which is so degrading to a German professor, and in support referred to, what do you think? Avenarius' Prolegomena, where, supposedly, the concept of substance has been annihilated. A convenient theory, indeed, that can be made to embrace both purely idealist works and arbitrarily assumed materialist premises. Avenarius' critique of pure experience, of course, does not contradict this teaching, that is, materialism, writes Petzold, but neither does it contradict the directly opposite spiritualist doctrine. An excellent defense. This is exactly what Engels called a pauper's broth of eclecticism. Bogdanov, who refuses to own himself a Machian and who wants to be considered a Marxist in philosophy, follows Petzold. He asserts that Empirio-Criticism is not concerned with materialism, or with spiritualism, or with metaphysics in general, that truth does not lie in the golden mean between the conflicting trends, materialism and spiritualism, but lies outside of both. What appeared to Bogdanov to be truth is, as a matter of fact, confusion, a wavering between materialism and idealism. Karstanjan, rebutting Want, said that he absolutely repudiated this importation, Unterscheibung, of a materialist element, which is utterly foreign to the critique of pure experience. Empirio-criticism is skepticism preeminently in relation to the content of the concepts. There is a grain of truth in this insistent emphasis on the neutrality of Machism. The amendment made by Mach and Avenarius to their original idealism amounts to partial concessions to materialism. Instead of the consistent standpoint of Berkeley, the external world is my sensation, we sometimes get the who mean standpoint, I exclude the question whether or not there is anything beyond my sensations. And this agnostic standpoint inevitably condemns one to vacillate between materialism and idealism. The principal coordination and naive realism of Avenarius' doctrine of the principal coordination is expounded in the human concept of the world and in the notes. The second was written later, and in it Avenarius emphasizes that he is expounding, it is true in a somewhat altered form, something that is not different from the critique of pure experience and the human concept of the world, but exactly the same. Notes, 1894, p. 137 in the journal quoted above. The essence of this doctrine is the thesis of the indissoluble, unauflosliche, coordination, that is, the correlative connection of the self and the environment. p. 146. Expressed philosophically, Avenarius says here, one can say the self and not self. We always find together, immer eins zusammen vorgefunden, the one and the other, the self and the environment. No full description of what we find, de vorgefundenem, can contain an environment without some self, ein Ich, whose environment it is, even though it be only the self that is describing what is found, das vorgefunden. p. 146. The self is called the central term of the coordination, the environment the counter term, Gegenglied. Confer. Der menschliche Weltbegriff, 2. Auflage, 1905, p. 83-84, paragraph 148 ff. Avenarius claims that by this doctrine he recognizes the full value of what is known as naive realism, that is, the ordinary, non-philosophical, naive view which is entertained by all people who do not trouble themselves as to whether they themselves exist and whether the environment, the external world, exists. Expressing his solidarity with Avenarius, Mach also tries to represent himself as a defender of naive realism. Analysis of Sensations, p. 39. The Russian Machians, without exception, believed Mach's and Avenarius' claim that this was indeed a defense of naive realism. The self is acknowledged, the environment is acknowledged, what more do you want? in order to decide who actually possesses the greatest degree of naivete, let us proceed from a somewhat remote starting point. Here is a popular dialogue between a certain philosopher and his reader. Reader, the existence of a system of things, according to ordinary philosophy, is required, and from them only is consciousness to be derived. Author, now you are speaking in the spirit of a professional philosopher, and not according to human common sense and actual consciousness. Tell me, and reflect well before you answer, does a thing appear in you and become present in you and for you otherwise than simultaneously with and through your consciousness of the thing? Reader, upon sufficient reflection, I must grant you this. Author, now you are speaking from yourself, from your heart. Take care, therefore, not to jump out of yourself and to apprehend anything otherwise than you are able to apprehend it, as consciousness and, the italics are the philosophers, the thing and consciousness. Or, more precisely, neither the one nor the other, but that which only subsequently becomes resolved into the two, that which is the absolute subjective objective and objective subjective. Here you have the whole essence of the empirio-critical principle coordination, the latest defense of naive realism by the latest positivism. The idea of indissoluble coordination is here stated very clearly and as though it were a genuine defense of the point of view of the common man, undistorted by the subtleties of the professional philosophers. But, as a matter of fact, this dialogue is taken from the work of a classical representative of subjective idealism, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, published in 1801. There is nothing but a paraphrase of subjective idealism in the teachings of Mach and Avenarius we are examining. The claim that they have risen above materialism and idealism, that they have eliminated the opposition between the point of view that proceeds from the thing to consciousness and the contrary point of view, is but the empty claim of a renovated Fichteanism. Fichte too imagined that he had indissolubly connected the self and the environment, the consciousness and the thing, that he had solved the problem by the assertion that a man cannot jump out of himself. In other words, the Berkeleyan argument is repeated: I perceive only my sensations, I have no right to assume objects in themselves outside of my sensation. The different methods of expression used by Berkeley in 1710, by Fichte in 1801, and by Avenarius in 1891–94 do not in the least change the essence of the matter, viz. the fundamental philosophical line of subjective idealism. The world is my sensation. The non-self is postulated, is created, produced, by the self. The thing is indissolubly connected with the consciousness. The indissoluble coordination of the self and the environment is the empirio-critical principle coordination. This is all one and the same proposition, the same old trash with a slightly refurbished, or repainted, signboard. The reference to naive realism, supposedly defended by this philosophy, is sophistry of the cheapest kind. The naive realism of any healthy person who has not been an inmate of a lunatic asylum or a pupil of the idealist philosophers consists in the view that things, the environment, the world, exist independently of our sensation, of our consciousness, of ourself and of man in general. The same experience, not in the Machian sense, but in the human sense of the term, that has produced in us the firm conviction that independently of us there exist other people, and not mere complexes of my sensations of high, short, yellow, hard, etc. This same experience produces in us the conviction that things, the world, the environment exist independently of us. Our sensation, our consciousness is only an image of the external world, and it is obvious that an image cannot exist without the thing imaged, and that the latter exists independently of that which images it. Materialism deliberately makes the naive belief of mankind the foundation of its theory of knowledge. Is not the foregoing evaluation of the principle coordination a product of the materialist prejudice against Machism? Not at all. Specialists in philosophy who cannot be accused of partiality towards materialism, who even detest it and who accept one or other of the idealist systems, agree that the principle coordination of Avenarius and company is subjective idealism. Wundt, for instance, whose interesting opinion was not understood by Mr. Yushkevich, explicitly states that Avenarius' theory, according to which a full description of the given or the found is impossible without some self, an observer or describer, is a false confusion of the content of real experience with reflections about it. Natural science, says Wundt, completely abstracts from every observer. Such abstraction is possible only because the attribution, Hinzudenken, of an experiencing individual to every content of experience, which the empirio-critical philosophy, in agreement with the immanentist philosophy, assumes, is in general an empirically unfounded assumption arising from a false confusion of the content of real experience with reflections about it. Locke. Cit. p. 382. For the immanentists, Schuppe, Remke, Leclerc, Schubert-Sottern, who themselves voice, as we shall see later, their hearty sympathy with Avenarius, proceed from this very idea of the indissoluble connection between subject and object. And W. Wundt, before analyzing Avenarius, demonstrated in detail that the immanentist philosophy is only a modification of Berkeleyanism, that however much the immanentists may deny their kinship with Berkeley, we should not allow verbal differences to conceal from us the deeper content of these philosophical doctrines, viz. Berkeleyanism or Fichteanism. The English writer Norman Smith, analyzing Avenarius' philosophy of pure experience, puts this criticism in an even more straightforward and emphatic form. Most readers of Avenarius' The Human Concept of the World will probably agree that, however convincing his criticism of idealism, it is tantalizingly elusive in its positive teaching. So long as we seek to interpret his theory of experience in the form in which it is avowedly presented, namely, as genuinely realistic, it eludes all clear comprehension. Its whole meaning seems to be exhausted in negation of the subjectivism which it overthrows. It is only when we translate Avenarius' technical terms into more familiar language that we discover where the real source of the mystification lies. Avenarius has diverted attention from the defects of his position by directing his main attack against the very weakness, that is, of the idealist position, which is fatal to his own theory. Throughout the whole discussion, the vagueness of the term experience stands him in good stead. Sometimes it means experiencing, and at other times the experienced, the latter meaning being emphasized when the nature of the self is in question. These two meanings of the term experience practically coincide with his important distinction between the absolute and the relative standpoints. I have examined above what significance this distinction has for Avenarius, and these 2 points of view are not in his philosophy really reconciled. For when he allows as legitimate the demand that experience be ideally completed in thought, the full description of the environment is ideally completed by thinking of an observing self, he makes an admission which he cannot successfully combine with his assertion that nothing exists save in relation to the self. The ideal completion of given reality which results from the analysis of material bodies into elements which no human senses can apprehend. Here are meant the material elements discovered by natural science, the atoms, electrons, etc., and not the fictitious elements invented by Mach and Avenarius, or from following the earth back to a time when no human being existed upon it, is, strictly, not a completion of experience, but only of what is experienced. It completes only one of the two aspects which Avenarius has asserted to be inseparable. It leads us not only to what has not been experienced but to what can never by any possibility be experienced by beings like ourselves. But here again the ambiguities of the term experience come to Avenarius' rescue. He argues that thought is as genuine a form of experience as sense-reception, and so in the end falls back on the time-worn argument of subjective idealism, that thought and reality are inseparable, because reality can only be conceived in thought, and thought involves the presence of the thinker. Not, therefore, any original and profound re-establishment of realism, but only the restatement in its crudest form of the familiar position of subjective idealism is the final outcome of Avenarius' positive speculations. p. 29. The mystification wrought by Avenarius, who completely duplicates Fichte's error, is here excellently exposed. The much-vaunted elimination of the antithesis between materialism, Norman Smith should not have used the term realism, and idealism by means of the term experience instantly proves to be a myth as soon as we proceed to definite and concrete problems. Such, for instance, is the problem of the existence of the earth prior to man, prior to any sentient being. We shall presently speak of this point in detail. Here we will note that not only Norman Smith, an opponent of his theory, but also W. Schuppe, the immanentist, who warmly greeted the appearance of the human concept of the world as a confirmation of naive realism unmasks Avenarius and his fictitious realism. The fact of the matter is that Ch1 fully agrees with such realism, that is, the mystification of materialism dished out by Avenarius. Such realism, he wrote to Avenarius, I, the eminentest philosopher, who have been slandered as a subjective idealist, have always claimed with as much right as yourself, Huck verehrter Herr College. My conception of thought excellently harmonizes, vertragt sich vortrefflich, with your pure experience. p. 384. The connection and inseparability of the two terms of the coordination are in fact provided only by the self, das Ich, the abstract, Fichtean self-consciousness, thought divorced from the brain. That which you desired to eliminate you have tacitly assumed, so Ch1 wrote to Avenarius. p. 388. And it is difficult to say who more rudely unmasks Avenarius the mystifier, Smith by his straightforward and clear refutation, or Ch1 by his enthusiastic opinion of Avenarius' crowning work. The kiss of Wilhelm Ch1 in philosophy is no better than the kiss of Peter Struve or Menshikov in politics. O. Ewald, who praises Mach for not succumbing to materialism, speaks of the principal coordination in a similar manner. If one declares the correlation of central term and counter term to be an epistemological necessity which cannot be avoided, then, even though the word Empirio-Criticism be inscribed on the signboard in shrieking letters, one is adopting a standpoint that differs in no way from absolute idealism. The term is incorrect. He should have said subjective idealism, for Hegel's absolute idealism is reconcilable with the existence of the earth, nature, and the physical universe without man, since nature is regarded as the otherness of the absolute idea. On the other hand, if we do not hold fast to this coordination and grant the counter-terms their independence, then the way is at once open for every metaphysical possibility, especially in the direction of transcendental realism. Opposite. Pages 56-57. By metaphysics and transcendental realism, Herr Friedlander, who is disguised under the pseudonym Ewald, means materialism. Himself professing one of the varieties of idealism, he fully agrees with the Machians and the Kantians that materialism is metaphysics, from beginning to end the wildest metaphysics. p. 134. On the question of the transcendence and the metaphysical character of materialism he is in agreement with Bazaroff and all our Machians, and of this we shall have occasion to say more later. Here again it is important to note how in fact the shallow and pedantic claim to have transcended idealism and materialism vanishes, and how the question arises inexorably and irreconcilably. To grant the counter-terms their independence means, if one translates the pretentious language of the affected Avenarius into common parlance, to regard nature and the external world as independent of human consciousness and sensation. And that is materialism. To build a theory of knowledge on the hypothesis of the indissoluble connection between the object and human sensation, complexes of sensations, as identical with bodies, world elements that are identical both psychically and physically, Avenarius coordination, and so forth, is to land inevitably into idealism. Such is the simple and unavoidable truth that with a little attention may be easily detected beneath the piles of affected quasi-erudite terminology of Avenarius, Ch1, Ewald and the others, which deliberately obscures matters and frightens the general public away from philosophy. The reconciliation of Avenarius' theory with naive realism in the end aroused misgivings even among his own disciples. For instance, R. Willi says that the common assertion that Avenarius came to adopt naive realism should be taken cum grano salis. As a dogma, naive realism would be nothing but the belief in things in themselves existing outside man, außerpersönliche, in their perceptible form. In other words, the only theory of knowledge that is really created by an actual and not fictitious agreement with naive realism is, according to Willi, materialism. And Willi, of course, rejects materialism. But he is compelled to admit that Avenarius in the human concept of the world restores the unity of experience, the unity of the self and the environment, by means of a series of complicated and extremely artificial subsidiary and intermediary conceptions. p. 171. The human concept of the world, being a reaction against the original idealism of Avenarius, entirely bears the character of a reconciliation, Einsatzgleiches, between the naive realism of common sense and the epistemological idealism of school philosophy. But that such a reconciliation could restore the unity and integrity of experience, Willi calls it Grunderfahrung, that is, basic experience, another new world. I would not assert. p. 170. A valuable admission. Avenarius' experience failed to reconcile idealism and materialism. Willi, it seems, repudiates the school philosophy of experience in order to replace it by a philosophy of basic experience, which is confusion thrice confounded. Did nature exist prior to man? We have already seen that this question is particularly repugnant to the philosophy of Mach and Avenarius. Natural science positively asserts that the earth once existed in such a state that no man or any other creature existed or could have existed on it. Organic matter is a later phenomenon, the fruit of a long evolution. It follows that there was no sentient matter, no complexes of sensations, no self that was supposedly indissolubly connected with the environment in accordance with Avenarius' doctrine. Matter is primary, and thought, consciousness, sensation are products of a very high development. Such is the materialist theory of knowledge, to which natural science instinctively subscribes. The question arises, have the eminent representatives of Empirio-Criticism observed this contradiction between their theory and natural science? They have observed it, and they have definitely asked themselves by what arguments this contradiction can be removed. Three attitudes to this question are of particular interest from the point of view of materialism, that of Avenarius himself and those of his disciples J. Petzold and R. Willi. Avenarius tries to eliminate the contradiction to natural science by means of the theory of the potential central term in the coordination. As we know, coordination is the indissoluble connection between self and environment. In order to eliminate the obvious absurdity of this theory, the concept of the potential central term is introduced. For instance, what about man's development from the embryo? Does the environment, the counter term, exist if the central term is represented by an embryo? The embryonic system C, Avenarius replies, is the potential central term in relation to the future individual environment. The potential central term is never equal to zero, even when there are as yet no parents, Elverlichkeibestandteil, but only the integral parts of the environment capable of becoming parents. p. 141. The coordination then is indissoluble. It is essential for the Empirio-Criticist to assert this in order to save the fundamentals of his philosophy, sensations and their complexes. Man is the central term of this coordination. But when there is no man, when he has not yet been born, the central term is nevertheless not equal to zero. It has only become a potential central term. It is astonishing that there are people who can take seriously a philosopher who advances such arguments. Even Wundt, who stipulates that he is not an enemy of every form of metaphysics, that is, of fideism, was compelled to admit the mystical obscuration of the concept experience by the word potential, which destroys coordination entirely. Opposite. p. 379. And, indeed, how can one seriously speak of a coordination the indissolubility of which consists in one of its terms being potential? Is this not mysticism, the very antechamber of fideism? If it is possible to think of the potential central term in relation to a future environment, why not think of it in relation to a past environment, that is, after man's death? You will say that Avenarius did not draw this conclusion from his theory? Granted, but that absurd and reactionary theory became the more cowardly but not any the better for that. Avenarius, in 1894, did not carry this theory to its logical conclusion, or perhaps feared to do so. But R. Schubert Sothern, as we shall see, resorted in 1896 to this very theory to arrive at theological conclusions, which in 1906 earned the approval of Mach, who said that Schubert-Soldern was following very close paths to Machism. Analysis of sensations, p. 4. Engels was quite right in attacking Dühring, an avowed atheist, for inconsistently leaving loopholes for fideism in his philosophy. Engels several times, and justly, brought this accusation against the materialist Dühring, although the latter had not drawn any theological conclusions, in the 70s at least. But we have among us people who would have us regard them as Marxists, yet who bring to the masses a philosophy which comes very close to fideism. Avenarius wrote in the Bimmerkunden, "It would seem that from the empirio-critical standpoint natural science is not entitled to inquire about periods of our present environment which in time preceded the existence of man." p. 144. Avenarius answers, "The inquirer cannot avoid mentally projecting himself, sich hinzudenken, that is, imagining oneself to be present. What the scientist wants, although he may not be clearly aware of it, is essentially only this: how is the earth to be defined prior to the appearance of living beings or a man? If I were mentally to project myself in the role of a spectator, in much the same way as though it were thinkable that we could from our earth follow the history of another star or of another solar system with the help of perfected instruments. An object cannot exist independently of our consciousness. We always mentally project ourselves as the intelligence endeavoring to apprehend the object. This theory of the necessity of mentally projecting the human mind to every object and to nature prior to man is given by me in the first paragraph in the words of the recent positivist, R. Avenarius, and in the second, in the words of the subjective idealist, J. G. Fichte. The sophistry of this theory is so manifest that it is embarrassing to analyze it. If we mentally project ourselves, our presence will be imaginary, but the existence of the earth prior to man is real. Man could not in practice be an observer, for instance, of the earth in an incandescent state, and to imagine his being present at the time is obscurantism, exactly as though I were to endeavor to prove the existence of hell by the argument that if I mentally projected myself thither as an observer I could observe hell. The reconciliation of empirio-criticism and natural science amounts to this, that Avenarius graciously consents to mentally project something the possibility of admitting which is excluded by natural science. No man at all, educated or sound-minded, doubts that the earth existed at a time when there could not have been any life on it, any sensation or any central term, and consequently the whole theory of Mach and Avenarius, from which it follows that the earth is a complex of sensations. Bodies are complexes of sensations, or complexes of elements in which the psychical and physical are identical, or a counter-term of which the central term can never be equal to zero, is philosophical obscurantism, the carrying of subjective idealism to absurdity. J. Petzold perceived the absurdity of the position into which Avenarius had fallen and felt ashamed. In his introduction to the Philosophy of Pure Experience, Volume 2, he devotes a whole paragraph to the question of the reality of earlier, früher, periods of the earth. Petzold says, in the teaching of Avenarius the self, das Ich, plays a role different from that which it plays with Schuppi. Let us note that Petzold openly and repeatedly declares, our philosophy was founded by three men, Avenarius, Mach and Schuppi, yet it is a role which, perhaps, possesses too much importance for his theory. Petzold was evidently influenced by the fact that Schuppi had unmasked Avenarius by showing that with him too everything rests entirely on the self, and Petzold wishes to make a correction. Avenarius said on one occasion that we can think of a region where no human foot has yet trodden, but to be able to think, italicized by Avenarius, of such an environment there is required what we designate by the term self, Ich Besitz, whose, italicized by Avenarius, thought the thinking is. V.F. Wis. Ph. 18. B.D. 1894, p. 146, n. Petzold replies, the epistemologically important question, however, is not whether we can think of such a region at all, but whether we are entitled to think of it as existing, or as having existed, independently of any individual mind. Ibid. p. 324. Right is right. People can think and mentally project for themselves any kind of hell and any kind of devil. Lunacharsky even mentally projected for himself, well, to use a mild expression, religious conceptions. But it is precisely the purpose of the theory of knowledge to show the unreal, fantastic and reactionary character of such projections. For, that the system C, that is, the brain, is necessary for thought is obvious both for Avenarius and for the philosophy which is here presented. Ibid. p. 324. That is not true. Avenarius' theory of 1876 is a theory of thought without brain. And in his theory of 1891–94, as we shall presently see, there is a similar element of idealist nonsense. But is this system C a condition of existence, italicized by Petzold, of, say, the Mesozoic period, Sekundazeit, of the Earth? Ibid. p. 324. And Petzold, presenting the argument of Avenarius I have already cited on the subject of what science actually wants and how we can mentally project, the spectator, objects, no. We wish to know whether I have the right to think that the Earth at that remote epoch existed in the same way as I think of it as having existed yesterday or a minute ago. Or must the existence of the Earth be really made conditional, as Willie claimed, on our right at least to assume that at the given period there coexisted some system C, even though at the lowest stage of its development? Ibid. p. 325. Of this idea of Willie's we shall speak presently. Avenarius evades Willie's strange conclusion by the argument that the person who puts the question cannot mentally remove himself, sick wegdenken, that is, think himself as absent, nor can he avoid mentally projecting himself. Sick hinzuzudenken, see Avenarius, The Human Concept of the World, 1st Germ. Ed. p. 130. But then Avenarius makes the individual self of the person who puts the question, or the thought of such a self, the condition not only of the act of thought regarding the uninhabitable earth, but also of the justification for believing in the existence of the earth at that time. These false paths are easily avoided if we do not ascribe so much theoretical importance to the self. The only thing the theory of knowledge should demand of the various conceptions of that which is remote in space or time is that it be conceivable and uniquely, eindeutig, determined. The rest is the affair of the special sciences. Volume 2, p. 325. Petzold rechristened the law of causality the law of unique determination and imported into his theory, as we shall see later, the a priority of this law. This means that Petzold saves himself from Avenarius' subjective idealism and solipsism. He attributes an exaggerated importance to the self, as the professorial jargon has it, with the help of Kantian ideas. The absence of the objective factor in Avenarius' doctrine, the impossibility of reconciling it with the demands of natural science, which declares the earth, object, to have existed long before the appearance of living beings, subject, compelled Petzold to resort to causality, unique determination. The earth existed, for its existence prior to man is causally connected with the present existence of the earth. Firstly, where does causality come from? A priori, says Petzold. Secondly, are not the ideas of hell, devils, and Lunacharsky's mental projections also connected by causality? Thirdly, the theory of the complexes of sensations in any case turns out to be destroyed by Petzold. Petzold failed to resolve the contradiction he observed in Avenarius, and only entangled himself still more, for only one solution is possible, viz. the recognition that the external world reflected by our mind exists independently of our mind. This materialist solution alone is really compatible with natural science, and it alone eliminates both Petzold's and Mach's idealist solution of the question of causality, which we shall speak of separately. The third Empirio-Criticist, R. Willie, first raised the question of this difficulty in Avenarius' philosophy in 1896, in an article entitled Der Empirio-Criticismus als einzig wissenschaftlicher Standpunkt. Empirio-Criticism is the only scientific standpoint. What about the world prior to man? Willie asks here, and at first answers according to Avenarius, we project ourselves mentally into the past. But then he goes on to say that we are not necessarily obliged to regard experience as human experience. For we must simply regard the animal kingdom, be it the most insignificant worm, as primitive fellow man, Mitmenschen, if we regard animal life in connection with general experience. Pages 73-74. Thus, prior to man the earth was the experience of a worm, which discharged the functions of the central term in order to save Avenarius' coordination and Avenarius' philosophy. No wonder Petzold tried to dissociate himself from an argument which is not only the height of absurdity, ideas of the earth corresponding to the theories of the geologists attributed to a worm, but which does not in any way help our philosopher, for the earth existed not only before man, but before any living being generally. Willie returned to the question in 1905. The worm was now removed. But Petzold's law of unique determination could not, of course, satisfy Willie, who regarded it merely as logical formalism. The author says, will not the question of the world prior to man, as Petzold puts it, lead us back again to the things in themselves of common sense? That is, to materialism. How terrible indeed! What does millions of years without life mean? Is time perhaps a thing in itself? Of course not. And that means that things outside man are only impressions, bits of fantasy fabricated by men with the help of a few fragments we find about us. And why not? Need the philosopher fear the stream of life? And so I say to myself, abandon all this love of systems and grasp the moment, Ergriff den Augenblick, the moment you are living in, the moment which alone brings happiness. Pages 177-78. Well. Either materialism or solipsism, this, in spite of his vociferous phrases, is what Willie arrives at when he analyzes the question of the existence of nature before man. To summarize, 3 augurs of Empirio-Criticism have appeared before us and have labored in the sweat of their brow to reconcile their philosophy with natural science, to patch up the holes of solipsism. Avenarius repeated Fichte's argument and substituted an imaginary world for the real world. Petzold withdrew from Fichtean idealism and moved towards Kantian idealism. Willie, having suffered a fiasco with the worm, threw up the sponge and inadvertently blurted out the truth, either materialism or solipsism, or even the recognition of nothing but the present moment. It only remains for us to show the reader how this problem was understood and treated by our own native Machians. Here is Bazaroff in the Studies in the Philosophy of Marxism. It remains for us now, under the guidance of our faithful Vademecum, that is, Plekhanov, to descend into the last and most horrible circle of the solipsist inferno, into that circle where, as Plekhanov assures us, every subjective idealism is menaced with the necessity of conceiving the world as it was contemplated by the ichthyosauruses and archaeopteryxes. Let us mentally transport ourselves, writes Plekhanov, to that epoch when only very remote ancestors of man existed on the earth, for instance, to the Mesozoic period. The question arises, what was the status of space, time and causality then? Whose subjective forms were they then? Were they the subjective forms of the ichthyosauruses? And whose intelligence at that time dictated its laws to nature? The intelligence of the Archaeopteryx? To these queries the Kantian philosophy can give no answer. And it must be rejected as absolutely incompatible with modern science. L. Feuerbach, p. 117. Here Bazaroff breaks the quotation from Plekhanov just before a very important passage, as we shall soon see, namely, idealism says that without subject there is no object. The history of the earth shows that the object existed long before the subject appeared, that is, long before the appearance of organisms possessing a perceptible degree of consciousness. The history of development reveals the truth of materialism. We continue the quotation from Bazarov. But does Plekhanov's thing in itself provide the desired solution? Let us remember that even according to Plekhanov we can have no idea of things as they are in themselves. We know only their manifestations, only the results of their action on our sense organs. Apart from this action they possess no aspect. L. Feuerbach, p. 112. What sense organs existed in the period of the ichthyosaurus? Evidently, only the sense organs of the ichthyosaurus and their like. Only the ideas of the ichthyosaurus were then the actual, the real manifestations of things in themselves. Hence, according to Plekhanov also, if the paleontologist desires to remain on real ground he must write the story of the Mesozoic period in the light of the contemplations of the ichthyosaurus. And, consequently, not a single step forward is made in comparison with solipsism. Such is the complete argument. The reader must pardon the lengthy quotation, we could not avoid it, of a Machian, an argument worthy of perpetuation as a first-class example of muddleheadedness. Bazarov imagines that Plekhanov gave himself away. If things in themselves, apart from their action on our sense organs, have no aspect of their own, then in the Mesozoic period they did not exist except as the aspect of the sense organs of the ichthyosaurus. And this is the argument of a materialist. If an aspect is the result of the action of things in themselves, on sense organs, it follows that things do not exist independently of sense organs of one kind or another. Let us assume for a moment that Bazarov indeed misunderstood Plekhanov's words, improbable as such an assumption may seem, that they did appear obscure to him. Be it so. We ask, is Bazarov engaged in a fencing bout with Plekhanov, whom the Machians exalt to the position of the only representative of materialism? Or is he endeavoring to clear up the problem of materialism? If Plekhanov seemed obscure to you, or contradictory, and so forth, why did you not turn to other materialists? Is it because you do not know them? But ignorance is no argument. If Bazarov indeed does not know that the fundamental premise of materialism is the recognition of the external world, of the existence of things outside and independent of our mind, this is truly a striking case of crass ignorance. We would remind the reader of Berkeley, who in 1710 rebuked the materialists for their recognition of objects in themselves, existing independently of our mind and reflected by our mind. Of course, everybody is free to side with Berkeley or anyone else against the materialists. That is unquestionable. But it is equally unquestionable that to speak of the materialists and distort or ignore the fundamental premise of all materialism is to import preposterous confusion into the problem. Was Plekhanov right when he said that for idealism there is no object without a subject, while for materialism the object exists independently of the subject and is reflected more or less adequately in the subject's mind? If this is wrong, then any man who has the slightest respect for Marxism should have pointed out this error of Plekhanov's, and should have dealt not with him, but with someone else, with Marx, Engels, or Feuerbach, on the question of materialism and the existence of nature prior to man. But if this is right, or, at least, if you are unable to find an error here, then your attempt to shuffle the cards and to confuse in the reader's mind the most elementary conception of materialism, as distinguished from idealism, is a literary indecency. As for the Marxists who are interested in the question apart from every little word uttered by Plekhanov, we shall quote the opinion of L. Feuerbach, who, as is known, perhaps not to Bazarov, was a materialist, and through whom Marx and Engels, as is well known, came from the idealism of Hegel to their materialist philosophy. In his rejoinder to R. Heim, Feuerbach wrote, "Nature, which is not an object of man or mind, is for speculative philosophy, or at least for idealism, a Kantian thing in itself." We shall speak later in detail of the fact that our Machians confuse the Kantian thing in itself with the materialist thing in itself, an abstraction without reality, but it is nature that causes the downfall of idealism. Natural science, at least in its present state, necessarily leads us back to a point when the conditions for human existence were still absent, when nature, that is, the earth, was not yet an object of the human eye and mind, when, consequently, nature was an absolutely non-human entity, absolute und menschliches Wesen. Idealism may retort, but nature also is something thought of by you, von der Dijk. Certainly, but from this it does not follow that this nature did not at one time actually exist, just as from the fact that Socrates and Plato do not exist for me if I do not think of them, it does not follow that Socrates and Plato did not actually at one time exist without me. This is how Feuerbach regarded materialism and idealism from the standpoint of the existence of nature prior to the appearance of man. Avenarius' sophistry, the mental projection of the observer, was refuted by Feuerbach, who did not know the recent positivism, but who thoroughly knew the old idealist sophistries. And Bazaroff offers us absolutely nothing new, but merely repeats the sophistry of the idealists. Had I been there, on earth, prior to man, I would have seen the world so and so. Studies in the Philosophy of Marxism, p. 29. In other words, if I make an assumption that is obviously absurd and contrary to natural science, that man can be an observer in an epoch before man existed, I shall be able to patch up the breach in my philosophy. This gives us an idea of the extent of Bazaroff's knowledge of the subject and of his literary methods. Bazaroff did not even hint at the difficulty with which Avenarius, Petzold and Willy wrestled. And, moreover, he made such a hash of the whole subject, placed before the reader such an incredible hodgepodge, that there ultimately appears to be no difference between materialism and solipsism. Idealism is represented as realism, and to materialism is ascribed the denial of the existence of things outside of their action on the sense organs. Truly, either Feuerbach did not know the elementary difference between materialism and idealism, or else Bazaroff and company have completely altered the elementary truths of philosophy. Or let us take Valentinov, a philosopher who, naturally, is delighted with Bazaroff. 1. Berkeley is the founder of the correlativist theory of the relativity of subject and object. p. 148. This is not Berkeleyan idealism. Oh, no. This is a profound analysis. 2. In the most realistic aspect, irrespective of the forms of their usual idealist interpretation, only interpretation. The fundamental premises of the theory are formulated by Avenarius. p. 148. Infants, as we see, are taken in by the mystification. 3. Avenarius' conception of the starting point of knowledge is that each individual finds himself in a definite environment. In other words, the individual and the environment are represented as connected and inseparable. Terms of one and the same coordination. p. 148. Delightful. This is not idealism. Bazaroff and Valentinov have risen above materialism and idealism. This inseparability of the subject and object is realism itself. 4. Is the reverse assertion correct, namely, that there is no counter-term to which there is no corresponding central term, an individual? Naturally. Not. In the Archean period the woods were verdant. Yet there was no man. p. 143. That means that the inseparable can be separated. Is that not natural? 5. Yet from the standpoint of the theory of knowledge, the question of the object in itself is absurd. p. 148. Of course. When there were no sentient organisms, objects were nevertheless complexes of elements, identical with sensations. 6. The immanentist school, in the person of Schubert, Sothern and Schuppe, clad these thoughts in an unsatisfactory form, and found itself in the cul-de-sac of solipsism. p. 149. But these thoughts, themselves, of course, contain no solipsism. and Empirio-Criticism, of course, is not a paraphrase of the reactionary theories of the immanentists, who lie when they declare themselves to be in sympathy with Avenarius. This, Messrs. Machians, is not philosophy, but an incoherent jumble of words. Does man think with the help of the brain? Bazaroff emphatically answers this question in the affirmative. He writes, if Plekhanov's thesis that consciousness is an internal Bazaroff state of matter be given a more satisfactory form, for example, that every mental process is a function of the cerebral process, then neither Mach nor Avenarius would dispute it. Studies in the Philosophy of Marxism, p. 29. To the mouse no beast is stronger than the cat. To the Russian Machians there is no materialist stronger than Plekhanov. Was Plekhanov really the only one, or the first, to advance the materialist thesis that consciousness is an internal state of matter? And if Bazaroff did not like Plekhanov's formulation of materialism, why did he take Plekhanov and not Engels or Feuerbach? Because the Machians are afraid to admit the truth. They are fighting materialism, but pretend that it is only Plekhanov they are fighting. A cowardly and unprincipled method. But let us turn to Empirio-Criticism. Avenarius would not dispute the statement that thought is a function of the brain. These words of Bazaroff's contain a direct untruth. Not only does Avenarius dispute the materialist thesis, but invents a whole theory in order to refute it. Avenarius says in the human concept of the world, the brain is not the habitation, the seat, the creator, it is not the instrument or organ, the supporter or substratum, etc., of thought. p. 76, approvingly quoted by Mach in the Analysis of Sensations, p. 32. Thought is not an inhabitant, or commander, or the other half, or side, etc., nor is it a product, or even a physiological function, or a state in general of the brain. Ibid. And Avenarius expresses himself no less emphatically in his notes. Presentations are not functions, physiological, psychical, or psychophysical, of the brain. Opposite. Paragraph 115, p. 419. Sensations are not psychical functions of the brain. Paragraph 116. Thus, according to Avenarius, the brain is not the organ of thought, and thought is not a function of the brain. Take Engels, and we immediately find directly contrary, frankly materialist formulations. Thought and consciousness, says Engels in and he during, are products of the human brain. 5th Germ. Ed. p. 22. This idea is often repeated in that work. In Ludwig Feuerbach we have the following exposition of the views of Feuerbach and Engels. The material, stofflich, sensuously perceptible world to which we ourselves belong is the only reality. Our consciousness and thinking, however supersensuous they may seem, are the product, Urzunas, of a material, bodily organ, the brain. Matter is not a product of mind, but mind itself is merely the highest product of matter. This is, of course, pure materialism. 4th German ed. p. 18. Or on page 4, where he speaks of the reflection of the processes of nature in the thinking brain, etc., etc. Avenarius rejects this materialist standpoint and says that the thinking brain is a fetish of natural science. The Human Concept of the World, 2nd German ed. p. 70. Hence, Avenarius cherishes no illusions concerning his absolute disagreement with natural science on this point. He admits, as do Mach and all the immanentists, that natural science holds an instinctive and unconscious materialist point of view. He admits and explicitly declares that he absolutely differs from the prevailing psychology. Notes, p. 150, etc. This prevailing psychology is guilty of an inadmissible introjection, such as the new term contrived by our philosopher, that is, the insertion of thought into the brain, or of sensations into us. These two words, into us, in uns, Avenarius goes on to say, contain the assumption, anam, that Empirio-Criticism disputes. This insertion, Hineinverlegung, of the visible, etc., into man is what we call introjection. Paragraph 45, p. 153. Introjection deviates in principle from the natural conception of the world, natuurlicher Weltbegriff, by substituting in me for before me, by turning a component part of the real environment into a component part of ideal thought. Ibid. Out of the amechanical, a new word in place of mental, which manifests itself freely and clearly in the experienced, or, in what is found, im Vorgefunden. Introjection makes something which hides itself, lateturendes, says Avenarius, another new word, mysteriously in the central nervous system. Ibid. Here we have the same mystification that we encountered in the famous defense of naive realism by the Empirio-Criticis and Eminentis. Avenarius here acts on the advice of the charlatan Turgenev, denounce most of all those vices which you yourself possess. Avenarius tries to pretend that he is combating idealism. Philosophical idealism, you see, is usually deduced from introjection. The external world is converted into sensation, into idea, and so forth, while I defend naive realism, the equal reality of everything presented, both self and environment, without inserting the external world into the human brain. The sophistry here is the same as that which we observed in the case of the famous coordination. While distracting the attention of the reader by attacking idealism, Avenarius is in fact defending idealism, albeit in slightly different words. Thought is not a function of the brain. The brain is not the organ of thought. Sensations are not a function of the nervous system. Oh, no. Sensations are elements, psychical only in one connection, while in another connection, although the elements are identical, they are physical. With his new and muddled terminology, with his new and pompous epithets, supposedly expressing a new theory, Avenarius merely beat about the bush and returned to his fundamental idealist premise. And if our Russian Machians, for example, Bogdanov, failed to notice the mystification and discerned a refutation of idealism in the new defense of idealism, in the analysis of Empirio-Criticism given by the professional philosophers we find a sober estimate of the true nature of Avenarius' ideas, which is laid bare when stripped of its pretentious terminology. In 1903 Bogdanov wrote, Richard Avenarius presented a most harmonious and complete philosophical picture of the development of the dualism of spirit and body. The gist of his doctrine of introjection is the following: we observe only physical bodies directly, and we infer the experiences of others, that is, the mind of another person, only by hypothesis. The hypothesis is complicated by the fact that the experiences of the other person are assumed to be located in his body, are inserted, introjected, into his organism. This is already a superfluous hypothesis, and even gives rise to numerous contradictions. Avenarius systematically draws attention to these contradictions by unfolding a series of successive historical facts in the development of dualism and of philosophical idealism. But here we need not follow Avenarius. Introjection serves as an explanation of the dualism of mind and body. Authoritative Thinking, from the Psychology of Society, p. 119, et seq. Bogdanov swallowed the bait of professorial philosophy in believing that introjection was aimed against idealism. He accepted the evaluation of introjection given by Avenarius himself at its face value and failed to notice the barb directed against materialism. Introjection denies that thought is a function of the brain, that sensations are a function of man's central nervous system, that is, it denies the most elementary truth of physiology in order to destroy materialism. Dualism, it appears, is refuted idealistically, notwithstanding all Avenarius' diplomatic rage against idealism, for sensation and thought prove to be not secondary, not a product of matter, but primary. Dualism is here refuted by Avenarius only in so far as he refutes the existence of the object without the subject, matter without thought, the external world independent of our sensations. That is, it is refuted idealistically. The absurd denial of the fact that the visual image of a tree is a function of the retina, the nerves and the brain, was required by Avenarius in order to bolster up his theory of the indissoluble connection of the complete experience, which includes not only the self but also the tree, that is, the environment. The doctrine of introjection is a muddle. It smuggles in idealistic rubbish and is contradictory to natural science, which inflexibly holds that thought is a function of the brain, that sensations, that is, the images of the external world, exist within us, produced by the action of things on our sense organs. The materialist elimination of the dualism of mind and body, that is, materialist monism, consists in the assertion that the mind does not exist independently of the body, that mind is secondary, a function of the brain, a reflection of the external world. The idealist elimination of the dualism of mind and body, that is, idealist monism, consists in the assertion that mind is not a function of the body, that, consequently, mind is primary, that the environment and the self exist only in an inseparable connection of one and the same complexes of elements. Apart from these two diametrically opposed methods of eliminating the dualism of mind and body, there can be no third method, unless it be eclecticism, which is a senseless jumble of materialism and idealism. And it was this jumble of Avenarius that seemed to Bogdanov and company the truth transcending materialism and idealism. But the professional philosophers are not as naive and credulous as are the Russian Machians. True, each of these professors and ordinary advocates his own system of refuting materialism, or, at any rate, of reconciling materialism and idealism. But when it comes to a competitor, they unceremoniously expose the unconnected fragments of materialism and idealism that are contained in all the recent and original systems. And if a few young intellectuals swallowed Avenarius' bait, that old bird Wundt was not to be enticed so easily. The idealist Wundt tore the mask from the poser Avenarius very unceremoniously when he praised him for the anti-materialist tendency of the theory of introjection. Wundt wrote, "If Empirio-Criticism reproaches vulgar materialism because by such expressions as the brain has thought, or the brain produces thought, it expresses a relation which generally cannot be established by factual observation and description, evidently, for Wundt it is a fact that a person thinks without the help of a brain." This reproach, of course, is well-founded. Opposite. S. pages 47-48. Well, of course. The idealists will always join the half-hearted Avenarius and Mach in attacking materialism. It is only a pity, Wundt goes on to say, that this theory of introjection does not stand in any relation to the doctrine of the independent vital series, and was, to all appearances, only tacked on to it as an afterthought and in a rather artificial fashion. p. 365. Introjection, says O. Ewald, is to be regarded as nothing but a fiction of Empirio-Criticism, which the latter requires in order to shield its own fallacies. Opposite. p. 44. We observe a strange contradiction. On the one hand, the elimination of introjection and the restoration of the natural world conception is intended to restore to the world the character of living reality. On the other hand, in the principal coordination, Empirio-Criticism is leading to a purely idealist theory of an absolute correlation of the counter term and the central term. Avenarius is thus moving in a circle. He set out to do battle against idealism, but laid down his arms before it came to an open skirmish. He wanted to liberate the world of objects from the yoke of the subject, but again bound that world to the subject. What he has actually destroyed by his criticism is a caricature of idealism rather than its genuine epistemological expression. Ibid. Pages 64-65. In his Avenarius frequently quoted statement, Norman Smith says that the brain is not the seat, organ or supporter of thought. He rejects the only terms which we possess for defining their connection. Opposite. p. 30. Nor is it surprising that the theory of introjection approved by Wundt excites the sympathy of the outspoken spiritualist, James Ward, who wages systematic war on naturalism and agnosticism, and especially on Thomas Huxley, not because he was an insufficiently outspoken and determined materialist, for which Engels reproached him, but because his agnosticism served in fact to conceal materialism. Let us note that Karl Pearson, the English Machian, who avoids all philosophical artifices, and who recognizes neither introjection, nor coordination, nor yet the discovery of the world elements, arrives at the inevitable outcome of Machism when it is stripped of such disguises, namely, pure subjective idealism. Pearson knows no elements. Sense impressions are his alpha and omega. He never doubts that man thinks with the help of the brain. And the contradiction between this thesis, which alone conforms with science, and the basis of his philosophy remains naked and obvious. Pearson spares no effort in combating the concept that matter exists independently of our sense impressions. The Grammar of Science, Chapter 7. Repeating all Berkeley's arguments, Pearson declares that matter is a non-entity. But when he comes to speak of the relation of the brain to thought, Pearson emphatically declares, from will and consciousness associated with material machinery we can infer nothing whatever as to will and consciousness without that machinery. He even advances the following thesis as a summary of his investigations in this field. Consciousness has no meaning beyond nervous systems akin to our own. It is illogical to assert that all matter is conscious, but it is logical to assert that all matter possesses a property which is essentially akin to sensation, the property of reflection, still more that consciousness or will can exist outside matter. Ibid. p. 75, second thesis. Pearson's muddle is glaring. Matter is nothing but groups of sense impressions. That is his premise, that is his philosophy. Hence, sensation and thought should be primary, matter, secondary. But no, consciousness without matter does not exist, and apparently not even without a nervous system. That is, consciousness and sensation are secondary. The waters rest on the earth rests on a whale, and the whale rests on the waters. Mach's elements and Avenarius coordination and introjection do not clear up this muddle, all they do is to obscure the matter, to cover up traces with the help of an erudite philosophical gibberish. Just such gibberish, and of this a word or two will suffice, is the special terminology of Avenarius, who coined a plenitude of diverse nodals, sequirals, fidentials, etc., etc. Our Russian Machians for the most part shamefacedly avoid this professorial rigmarole, and only now and again bombard the reader in order to stun him with an existential and such like. But if naive people take these words for a species of biomechanics, the German philosophers, who are themselves lovers of erudite words, laugh at Avenarius. To say nodal notice equals known, or to say that this or the other thing is known to me, is absolutely one and the same, says Wundt in the section entitled Scholastic Character of the Empirio-Critical System. And, indeed, it is the purest and most dreary scholasticism. One of Avenarius' most faithful disciples, R. Willie, had the courage to admit it frankly. He says, Avenarius dreamed of a biomechanics, but an understanding of the life of the brain can be arrived at only by actual discoveries, and not by the way in which Avenarius attempted to arrive at it. Avenarius' biomechanics is not grounded on any new observations whatever. Its characteristic feature is purely schematic constructions of concepts, and, indeed, constructions that do not even bear the nature of hypotheses that open up new vistas, but rather of stereotyped speculations, bloß Spekulier-Schablonen, which, like a wall, conceal our view. The Russian Machians will soon be like fashion lovers who are moved to ecstasy over a hat which has already been discarded by the bourgeois philosophers of Europe. The solipsism of Mach and Avenarius we have seen at the starting point, and the fundamental premise of the philosophy of Empirio-Criticism is subjective idealism. The world is our sensation. This is the fundamental premise, which is obscured but in no wise altered by the word element and by the theories of the independent series, coordination, and introjection. The absurdity of this philosophy lies in the fact that it leads to solipsism, to the recognition of the existence of the philosophizing individual only. But our Russian Machians assure their readers that to charge Mach with idealism, and even solipsism, is extreme subjectivism. So says Bogdanov in the introduction to the Russian translation of Analysis of Sensations, p. 11, and the whole Machian troupe repeated in a great variety of keys. Having examined the methods whereby Mach and Avenarius disguise their solipsism, we have now to add only one thing: the extreme subjectivism of assertion lies entirely with Bogdanov and company. For in philosophical literature writers of the most varied trends have long since disclosed the fundamental sin of Machism beneath all its disguises. We shall confine ourselves to a mere summary of opinions which sufficiently indicate the subjective ignorance of our Machians. Let us note in passing that nearly every professional philosopher sympathizes with one or another brand of idealism. In their eyes, idealism is not a reproach, as it is with us Marxists. But they point out Mach's actual philosophical trend and oppose one system of idealism by another system, also idealist, but to them more consistent. O. Ewald, in the book devoted to an analysis of Avenarius' teachings, writes, "The creator of Empirio-Criticism commits himself volens nolens to solipsism." Locke. Cit. Pages 61-62. Hans Kleinpeter, a disciple of Mach with whom Mach in his preface to Erkenntnis und Irrtum explicitly declares his solidarity, says, "It is precisely Mach who is an example of the compatibility of epistemological idealism with the demands of natural science, for the eclectic everything is compatible, and of the fact that the latter can very well start from solipsism without stopping there." Archive für Systematische Philosophie, B.D. 6, 1900, p. 87. E. Lucke, analyzing Mach's analysis of sensations, says, apart from this misunderstandings, misverstandness, Mach adopts the ground of pure idealism. It is incomprehensible that Mach denies that he is a Berkeleian. Kantstadion, B.D. 8, 1903, p. 416-17. W. Jerusalem, a most reactionary Kantian with whom Mach in the above-mentioned preface expresses his solidarity, says, consistent phenomenalism leads to solipsism, and therefore one must borrow a little from Kant. R. Honigswald says, the immanentists and the Empirio-Criticists face the alternative of solipsism or metaphysics in the spirit of Fichte, Schelling, or Hegel, über die Lehre Humes von der Realität der Außendinge. Hume's doctrine of the reality of the external world